Hello, this is Dr. Koiro, and the area that I feel like I have a lot of expertise involves reading digital text on the internet. For my ThinkAloud video, I'd like to share some strategies I use to help students navigate a set of complex online texts while learning more about Japanese internment during World War II. I selected this topic because it's a critical part of American history that profoundly influenced the United States during World War II. But unfortunately, it's a topic that is rarely covered in any depth in most U.S. history textbooks. The lesson as a whole focuses on reading critically across 5 diverse online sources that I've organized in a digital concept map. Students work together to read, discuss, and respond to the essential question you see in the orange box in the middle of the screen. The question is, how do different authors portray the Japanese internment camp experience to readers? This lesson, designed in this case for 9th grade students in American history class, addresses several higher-level reading standards outlined in the Common Core, and also gives students an opportunity to practice reading on the internet while learning more about equity, social justice, and the constitutional rights of American citizens. Before I begin the ThinkAloud part of my lesson, let me offer just a bit of context. Students have already spent a day in class reading and discussing 4 primary source documents to build their understanding of just what was happening at this point in history. This way, I help activate knowledge that some of my students have, and for others, it's a chance to build their knowledge in order to be more successful in completing the next part of the task. Together, yesterday, we listened to an audio recording of FDR's infamous speech declaring war on Japan after their attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941. We read the President's executive order authorizing the Japanese relocation in February of 1942. We talked about how people might have reacted to a poster outlining instructions to Japanese individuals as part of the relocation process. And we read about the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that authorized more than $1 billion to redress the injustices to Japanese Americans based solely on their race. During class today, students will work in small groups to analyze one of 4 different online sources to answer the central question in the middle of the concept map. Each group will use an online notepad template created in Westpiration to guide their reading and help them organize their group's thinking. This will help them share their ideas later with the whole class as well. I'll talk more about these elements of the notepad in just a bit, but this is what the notepad looks like. Since this task is likely to be pretty challenging for my students, I'll spend the first part of class giving a short think aloud about how I might tackle this text. I will focus my comments especially on how expert readers negotiate the challenges of reading critically within and across multiple sources of online information. I'll try to explain my thinking and give examples about how I will make a plan for beginning the task, how I determine what's important and if the information is credible, and how I use clues in the author's word choices and tone to determine an author's underlying agenda and potential biases. Along the way, I also remind my students how the notepad can help them organize their thinking within one website before they move across multiple websites. So let's get started by closely looking at the task and making a plan for where to start. For this task, I'm asked to form an opinion across 5 different texts. So I probably won't find an answer in any one place. In fact, since the question says different authors, I'm guessing I might have to compare and contrast opinions about Japanese internment that are different. In a way, this will be easy since I don't have to search for the 5 different texts. They're all linked to our concept map right here on this page. But I'll probably have to spend some time trying to learn more about the people who wrote each text to better understand why they have the opinions that they do. This can be pretty difficult, so I'm going to use this template to help me stay focused and organize information about each text. Since I'll be reading the first text in the list, I'm going to visit the source titled Lieutenant DeWitt's Final Report. So first, I'll just skim down the page a bit to get a sense of things. I can learn from the title and the first line that the author is General DeWitt. The year was 1942, and the document appears to be his final report on the evacuation of the Japanese. At the top of the website, it looks like the report is part of the virtual museum of the city of San Francisco. And if I click on that link and scroll to the bottom of that website, I learn this website is dedicated to research and education about San Francisco's history. If I return to the report and scroll to the bottom, I notice the formal citation for the report and the 2 links that lead me to the rest of his report and the Japanese internment page. If I follow the second link, the information gives me a little more background about the report and the events that were happening around that time in 1942. Since the website is hosted by the San Francisco Museum, I'm guessing it's going to be fairly accurate in the information that they're telling me about the Japanese internment at that time. So at this point, to stay focused, I'm going to go back to my template notepad just to remind myself what I should be looking for. And I'm really realizing just from skimming the report and a few links at the top and the bottom of the home page, I can already fill in the title, the website address, the source, and I can think about the purpose. So keep that in mind when you work in your small groups. Now, the notepad also reminds me that I need to figure out what motivated the author to write this report and find a quote that best represents the author's point of view about Japanese internment. This means I'm going to have to slow down and really read and think carefully as I work through what seems to be a pretty complicated report. To do this, I'm going to read carefully while asking myself a couple of questions. What clues can I notice about why this author must be writing to me? And what words does the author use to convey his feelings about the topic? Because I read this text a little earlier, let me give you some examples of what I mean. First, I notice the word choices, such as I transmit herewith and in recognition of this situation. These words give clues that this is a formal report, probably, rather than an informal letter to the general's relatives, for example. Then I notice in point 2 that the author begins with one short, direct statement. The evacuation was impelled by military necessity. This statement appears to sum up the author's feelings about the topic quickly and directly. So I added a note here to remind me of this key idea. And you can see the note here. Remember, you can use your Digo toolbar, like we practiced in class last week, to highlight the text on the website and add your own comments with your partners, so you can share them later with the class. As I continue to look through the next paragraph, I notice that the author chooses phrases such as highly sensitive installations, rabidly pro-Japanese, a menace which had to be dealt with, compulsory organized mass migration, and the phrase time was of the essence. I'm thinking that these words like rabidly, menace, compulsory, and essence evoke strong feelings and reinforce the author's argument in ways that make the reader believe there was no option but to evacuate this perceived threat to national security as soon as possible. This is definitely something to point out when we talk about author's craft. So let's stop and think now about filling in the template in a way that addresses our initial challenge. If we go back to the template, in addition to noting the source and the website address, I might talk with my group members now about how the ideas we read and highlighted help us A, identify the author's motivation, B, select a quote that best portrays this author's feelings about Japanese internment experience, and C, provide a short phrase in your own words that sums up this author's point of view. Once we figure that out, we can move on to use the key ideas on our notepad and compare the general's feelings with those of another author from our set of 5 sources. So I'm going to stop here and find out what questions you have about this process before you break into small groups to read about your author's purpose and your author's perspective on the issue of Japanese internment.